Demmin was a small town in northern Germany that for much of the war had remained untouched by destruction. Far from the main fronts and with no apparent strategic importance, its inhabitants lived with a false sense of shelter. But in the spring of 1945, the collapse of the Reich turned its streets into the stage for one of the most shocking tragedies of the war's end. The imminent arrival of the Red Army unleashed a wave of collective fear fueled by months of propaganda, atrocious rumors, and accounts from those fleeing the east. In a matter of hours, the town went from apparent calm to absolute chaos, destroyed bridges, unstoppable fires, crimes against civilians, and an unprecedented collective suicide. In the midst of that total collapse, hundreds of families chose to die rather than face what was coming. What exactly happened in those final days for an entire town to decide to vanish along with itself? The last civilian frontier of the Reich. Demen was a medium-sized administrative center with a well-defined agricultural tradition. The town stretched along the banks of 3 waterways. From there, rural roads led to neighboring settlements, while in the urban core, red brick houses, family-run businesses, and fields surrounding residential neighborhoods predominated. Until the beginning of 1945, the landscape remained untouched by the effects of air raids. The inhabitants led an almost stable life, although the echoes of war began to be felt more strongly as the fronts drew nearer. The first convoys of displaced people arrived in early February. They came from East Prussia, Pomerania, and other regions located to the east. They had abandoned their villages when Soviet forces advanced after breaking through the German lines. Some arrived in carts loaded with utensils, mattresses, and small animals. Others came on foot, holding their children by the hand. The flow was constant. The streets filled with people whose faces bore the marks of exhaustion, and the central market became a mandatory stop for those needing orientation or minimal assistance. Despite the evidence offered by the newcomers, many residents remained firm in the belief that the conflict would not seriously disrupt local life. The civil authorities did not establish emergency measures. Most businesses continued operating regularly, and public announcements were limited to administrative information. In schools, teachers continued to give lessons as usual, while in churches, sermons repeated the call to remain calm. Some testimonies preserved in parish records show that collective prayers for peace were offered, although masses did not register a notable increase in attendance. The sense of security was also sustained by the absence of bombings. Unlike other towns, Demen had not been attacked from the air. The population believed that the municipality's location far from strategic centers made it irrelevant to the Allies. This perception of immunity was reinforced when local newspapers published articles dismissing the possibility of direct clashes in the area. Propaganda broadcast by regional stations presented the enemy as a distant threat, concentrated on the Eastern Front, with no immediate connection to intermediate towns. In that climate, the idea took hold that when the time came, there would be enough leeway to organize a retreat or surrender the town without serious consequences. Marie Dabbs, who worked as a police officer in Demen, would later recall that many shared that impression. According to her statements, she personally offered assurances to several groups of refugees that the local administration would facilitate their evacuation if the danger materialized. She said, literally, that she would make sure they got out alive if foreign troops approached. For weeks, these words served as comfort for those who distrusted the apparent normality. Community meetings were frequent in parish halls, where the course of the conflict in other regions was discussed. Some of the newcomers recounted episodes that caused concern: looting, fires, and violent treatment by Soviet soldiers in villages located to the east. However, most of the townspeople considered them exaggerations or the product of trauma. It was thought that such accounts corresponded to isolated experiences, impossible to replicate in a town like Demen, whose population had not actively taken part in fighting nor hosted significant military facilities. On the outskirts of the town, there was a prisoner of war camp called Walderforst. It housed foreign internees under varying conditions, although no serious incidents were recorded there. The place was supervised by low-ranking military personnel, and its existence did not disrupt the town's daily rhythm. Some residents knew of its location, but paid it no special attention. During the first months of the year, the number of German soldiers in the area decreased progressively. The military authorities withdrew several units to key points, leaving less strategic areas with minimal presence. Even so, occasional patrols were organized on the outskirts, where the roads were watched over by small groups. As the days went by, news coming from the east began to gain space among the rumors. There was talk of Soviet columns that had reached points near the Oder River, a little over 100 kilometers away. Some refugees claimed to have seen armored vehicles or columns of smoke behind their villages. The truth of these testimonies could not be easily verified, as communications were unstable and telephone lines worked intermittently. Trains arriving in Demmin did so with delays or were diverted without prior notice, which increased uncertainty. The civil authorities maintained their initial stance: calm, order, and cooperation. Citizens were encouraged to take in the displaced and share available resources. In some homes, rooms were set up to receive entire families who had left their villages without knowing where they would end up. The number of inhabitants doubled in just a few weeks. Pressure on basic services began to be felt. Long lines formed at bakeries from dawn, and pharmacies limited the sale of certain products. Shopkeepers acted on their own initiative to regulate distribution in the absence of official instructions. The streets became noisier. Carts, animals, bicycles, and pedestrians filled all spaces. Children played among people waiting for news or help. The tension was visible in faces, although the conviction still prevailed that the town would not become a direct stage of the conflict. Despite everything, some signs began to break that sense of security. Troop movements were detected toward the north. News spread of medium-sized towns evacuated within hours. On several occasions, telegrams arrived warning of bombings in areas considered of little importance. In that context, the idea of an eventual retreat gained strength. Some groups prepared improvised escape routes toward neighboring villages. Paths were drawn through rural terrain, and locations of sheds or barns that could serve as temporary shelter were shared. Most of these plans were developed on individual initiative, as the authorities maintained their policy of waiting for instructions from higher levels. In that climate of uncertainty, the rumors intensified. Consultations in churches increased. Parish priests tried to maintain calm, but acknowledged the general unease. Some recommended prayer. Others suggested gathering personal documents and valuable objects in one place, in case it became necessary to flee suddenly. In the markets, people spoke of entire villages that had been destroyed without warning. The accounts of the newcomers began to gain more credibility. The presence of injured women, unaccompanied children, and disoriented elderly people fueled concern. Demen remained a city without combat, without gunfire, and without enemy columns on the horizon. But each day seemed to narrow the distance between the former life and an outcome that still could not be clearly described. The perception of remoteness had given way to constant vigilance. It was no longer just about taking in those who fled. Many were beginning to wonder if soon they themselves would have to leave everything behind. The machinery of fear. The final weeks of the war were marked by a systematic strategy that amplified fear in every corner of German territory. As defeats on the fronts were confirmed, the regime's broadcasters intensified their messages, reinforcing the image of an enemy advancing without respite. In official speeches, the soldiers from the east were described as savage invaders, barbaric formations from remote steppes, alien to any norm of humanity. The term Mongol hordes appeared frequently in radio bulletins, pamphlets, and internal communications. The directive was clear: plant the idea that surrendering or being captured was equivalent to vanishing without a trace. News arriving from captured cities reinforced that message. Some inhabitants of Demen heard accounts describing indiscriminate attacks, looting in villages, intentional fires, and women mistreated. Refugees who managed to escape told of episodes that fed collective anxiety. They claimed to have seen villages reduced to rubble, schools used as detention centers, and families separated amid the chaos. Every word conveyed the sense that violence was not a side effect, but a calculated practice. As days went by, those accounts ceased to be perceived as exaggerations. Even those who at first had been skeptical began to take precautions. Some families gathered valuables and documents in small wooden boxes, ready to be carried quickly. In wardrobes, bundles were prepared with clothing, basic food, and utensils. On the outskirts of the town, some neighbors marked improvised escape routes. There were no official confirmations, but the possibility of fleeing was beginning to be considered a real necessity. The idea that the enemy offered no terms spread through private conversations and casual encounters. Women avoided speaking of the matter in public, but shared among themselves fears that repeated disappearances, abuse, interrogations. The terror was not aimed at a specific event, but at a sum of possibilities that seemed inevitable. In that context, the local authorities chose to maintain an ambiguous stance. They did not confirm the news, but neither did they deny it. Some officials affirmed that the danger was real, while others recommended keeping calm. Confusion became the common state of the town. The local pastors recorded an increase in private consultations. Some parishioners asked whether carrying out certain acts was morally acceptable. Not all sought spiritual comfort. Some only wanted to hear a phrase that would allow them to move forward with their plans. In the parish records, brief phrases were noted that revealed the emotional state of those present. "We have no way out. Time is up. I don't want my children to suffer." These expressions appeared frequently during the final weeks of April. In several schools, teachers suspended classes without official orders. Children stopped attending when their families began to lock themselves indoors. The streets, which had previously shown constant movement, became quieter. Curtains remained closed during the day. Outdoor gatherings were avoided. Some neighbors covered their windows with cardboard or thick blankets. Candles became the only source of light in many homes. No one wanted to be seen from the outside. Marie Dabbs, who in previous weeks had seemed confident, later expressed how wrong she had been. In her words, "How naive I was to think we could get out of this without consequences." She had promised several families she would help them if things became complicated, but soon realized she had no means to fulfill that promise. Around her, she saw people stop waiting for instructions and begin acting on their own. Trust in the authorities evaporated. Huber described in his writings how the regime used propaganda effectively to promote a sustained state of alarm. The construction of an absolute enemy made it easier for many people to justify extreme decisions. The language used did not appeal only to fear, but to a sense of imminent end. The phrases used in the bulletins were blunt. They destroy everything, they respect nothing, they show no mercy. These expressions appeared on household radios, in regional newspapers, and in messages transmitted from the last command centers. In other cities, the result was similar. In areas where the Red Army had not yet arrived, desperate acts occurred. Entire families disappeared without prior contact with foreign troops. The possibility that the danger was not immediate was not enough to stop the anxiety. The general context turned prevention into an urgent action. In many cases, neighbors acted before confirming whether the threat was real. In Demen, that pattern was beginning to repeat. Although no gunfire was yet heard and no enemy uniforms were seen, the atmosphere had changed. Doors were reinforced with furniture, blankets were piled near entrances, and some residents buried personal belongings in their gardens. In old buildings, staircases were blocked off, and access to attics was sealed. The town was preparing for an event whose shape was still unclear. The sound of retreating German military vehicles heightened the tension. Although the authorities issued no statements, the citizens understood that the defense had been abandoned. The presence of columns moving in the opposite direction, made up of trucks and motorcycles heading away from the front line, indicated that no one expected a prolonged confrontation in the town. That retreat was not announced. It simply happened, and the inhabitants were left in an operational void that intensified the feeling of abandonment. Some people gathered in small groups to exchange information. They spoke in low voices. No one fully trusted anyone else. The rumors grew increasingly specific, though they were difficult to verify. It was said that in nearby villages mass arrests had already taken place. Others claimed that certain roads were mined, that convoys were intercepted, that letters never reached their destination. Certainties were scarce, but fear spread quickly. Demen sealed off, no command, no way out. On the morning of April 30th, the first armoured vehicles of the Red Army approached the limits of Demen. Until that moment, the town had not experienced direct fighting. The Soviet columns had crossed the Oder River days earlier and were advancing rapidly northward. The offensive was part of the final maneuvers on German soil. The town's leaders, convinced that no real alternative existed, decided to raise a white flag on the church tower. The goal was to avoid an urban battle that would cause greater destruction. They sought to negotiate a peaceful entry, reduce material losses, and protect civilians. Surrender seemed a reasonable decision. The Soviet command, aware that this was not a militarily significant center, agreed to establish contact with local representatives. 3 soldiers were designated to deliver the terms of surrender. They carried clear instructions to avoid any aggression. According to available reports, the promise included preserving civilian property, preventing looting, and maintaining troop discipline. However, the situation turned at the city's defenses. The Soviet envoys approached the anti-tank trench, designated as the contact line. There, as they attempted to present the documents, they were intercepted by a mixed group of German soldiers and SS members. Witnesses stated that, without an exchange of words, fire was opened. The 3 negotiators were killed immediately. This event altered the course of events. From that moment on, any possibility of entry without resistance vanished. The idea of an organized handover was nullified. From the Soviet side, it was interpreted as an act of treachery. For the civilians of Demen, that moment marked the end of any expectation of an agreement. The decisions made afterward by the German forces sealed the town's fate. The Wehrmacht, in the process of retreat, detonated all the bridges connecting the urban center with the outside. The most important of them, the Kalden Bridge, was destroyed in a matter of minutes. With it disappeared the only structured route to cross the river. The explosions were heard in different sectors of the town. In total, all crossings over the 3 rivers that ran through Demen were destroyed. The structures collapsed into the water, blocking transit and leaving debris that made crossing impossible even on foot. The local authorities, with communications cut off and no means to control the situation, chose to abandon their duties. Later records confirmed that several officials disappeared without leaving any trace. There was no formal transfer of power and no clear instructions for the population. The absence of leadership caused total disorganization. Residents were left without coordination or means to organize an evacuation. Rural routes were cut off, and the main roads were impassable due to the destruction of the bridges. At the same time, Soviet convoys resumed their advance, surrounding the town from different directions. The idea of a collective escape lost all meaning. Within a few hours, Demen was completely isolated. It was trapped between bodies of water that, until then, had defined its agricultural landscape, but had now become impassable natural barriers. The well-known expression describing Demen's location as a land surrounded by 3 rivers took on a new meaning. The Peene, the Tolense, and the Treble, which had once provided resources and connectivity, became boundaries that blocked any exit. The topography acted like a prison. From the air, images showed an area completely enclosed by river channels. On the ground, the inhabitants realized that any attempt to flee meant overcoming debris, crossing deep waters, or walking for hours along unsafe routes. The population's reaction was one of bewilderment. Until the previous day, many believed that a possible way out existed. They trusted in an organized retreat, or at least a negotiated surrender. The destruction of the bridges eliminated all those alternatives. It was not only a physical obstacle, but also a clear message. There would be no safe routes and no evacuation points. The town was destined to remain closed, without assistance, without routes in or out. With the loss of both civil and military command, the breakdown was total. The local administration ceased to function, communications stopped broadcasting, and the population was left in isolation. There was no structured handover or any mechanism that could coordinate a response. The collapse was immediate. In that atmosphere, movement was reduced to a minimum. People withdrew to their homes, blocked entrances, and waited without certainty. Information circulated by word of mouth, almost always without confirmation. News arrived distorted, mixed with assumptions. Some claimed that foreign troops were already on the outskirts. Others believed there were still hours left. Several areas began reinforcing doors and windows. Lights were turned off, radio use was reduced, and unnecessary movements were avoided. The expectation of what might happen dominated conversations. It was a tense wait, sustained by the impossibility of escape and the absence of a negotiated way out. No one gave instructions, no one offered alternatives. April 30th marked the moment when Demen was sealed off. Its inhabitants, deprived of leadership and escape routes, faced a situation of complete encirclement. Surrounded by rivers and without viable connections, the town became a suspended space, trapped between what had been and what was about to come. The city surrendered to fire. When the Red Army crossed the limits of Demen, the town was already completely exposed. without command, without escape routes, and without organized resistance, as no one coordinated the reception nor did any authority present itself. The Soviet soldiers advanced through deserted streets, observing facades covered with white cloths. The message of surrender was visible, but it produced no change in their behavior. Within minutes, the armed groups began searching houses, breaking locks and taking personal belongings. The looting began as a systematic search. Some took watches, others dismantled radios, and many seized clothing or food. They entered without warning, demanded in a language incomprehensible to many, and rarely respected the residents' wishes. After searching the most visible houses, they also entered inner courtyards, back rooms and basements where entire families were hiding. What had begun as a military presence turned into an uncontrolled operation of occupation. Each street became a sequence of forced entries. The scenes multiplied without order or logic. There was no visible strategy, only scattered groups acting on their own. The promise of a disciplined entry vanished within hours. Some buildings were attacked intentionally. In other cases, fires spread through wooden structures, reaching neighboring houses. Columns of smoke covered the rooftops, while the flames advanced without interruption for 3 consecutive days. The flames altered the atmosphere. The air grew thick, with a darkened sky that reduced visibility to a few meters. The sound of objects breaking, mixed with shouts and gunfire, accompanied the arrival of the first armored vehicles. Residents sought refuge in basements, sheds, or partially collapsed structures. Some tried to flee through internal passageways but were intercepted. Others remained motionless, waiting for the armed groups to move away. The idea of protecting the most vulnerable became a priority. One of the accounts that sums up that confusion comes from Karl Schlosser. His family had hosted a Soviet soldier who, during the first hours, had seemed cooperative. He shared food, inspected the place without violence, and said he would cause no trouble. Apparently, he was seeking rest after weeks of combat. However, that attitude changed during the night. Without prior conflict or provocation, he assaulted Karl's mother. The young man witnessed how that man, who hours earlier had seemed harmless, became an immediate threat. There was no opportunity to prevent the attack. It all happened within minutes. Then the aggressor left the house without looking back. As the hours passed, the town became unrecognizable. The wooden areas burned more quickly. The heat made it impossible to access certain zones, and smoke covered windows and walls. People who ventured outside were intercepted by armed groups, forced to retreat, or stripped of what they carried. During those 3 days, Demen lost almost all of its buildings. It is estimated that nearly 80% of the town was destroyed by fire or looting. Some homes withstood the flames, but they were left empty, without roofs, without doors, and with their interiors devastated. Families who managed to keep something did so by hiding objects in wells, inside false walls, or in nearby fields. On the outer roads, the smoke was visible for kilometers. Neighboring villages watched for days as the grey column rose over the horizon. Some thought it was a reprisal offensive. Others could not understand why a defenseless town was subjected to such a level of destruction. There were no explanations or statements, nor any official accounts. Everything known circulated among families, survivors, or retreating soldiers. The contrast between previous expectations and reality was overwhelming. Days earlier, some believed that surrender would prevent serious consequences. It was thought that showing white flags or handing over weapons would be enough to be spared. But the entry of the Red Army did not respect those signals. Houses marked were searched just the same. In some areas, peace symbols were ignored. In others, they were destroyed outright. The message the population received was that no real protection existed. The idea that everything happening was a military necessity quickly vanished. The violence seemed arbitrary, without a direct link to war objectives. The looting had no pattern. The houses attacked contained no strategic resources or hidden weaponry. The choice of targets was based on opportunity, not logic. In many cases, people were forced to leave their homes only to watch them be reduced to ashes. The constant sense of insecurity extended into the shelters. Those who remained hidden did not know how long they would have to hold out or what to expect. Entrances were fragile, hiding places unsafe, and fear gave no respite. Later accounts agreed in describing those hours as an endless wait. Every sound from outside could signal a violent entry. Every long silence fed the tension. In certain neighborhoods, some tried to organize observation points or warning signals. But without means of communication, without radios, and without connections between groups, the efforts were minimal. Individual actions replaced any collective attempt. Each family improvised solutions. Some built interior barricades, others turned off all lights and kept children silent for days. The streets were covered in debris, furniture torn off doors, scattered clothing, broken utensils. What had once been gardens or courtyards was transformed into burned or empty spaces. Water sources were used in attempts to extinguish fires, but in most cases they were insufficient. Hand pumps could not reach burning roofs. Cisterns were empty or out of service. The fire spread unchecked. Despite the attacks, some soldiers acted differently. Records exist of cases in which officers tried to stop the abuses, order the withdrawal of uncontrolled troops, or provide temporary shelter to civilians. But these actions were isolated. In most areas, the behavior was the opposite. Those who managed to keep documents or photographs described an unrecognizable environment. The central squares had disappeared, the bell towers collapsed, and the stations were consumed by flames. What remained standing was only part of the previous landscape. Urban signs, shop signs, and local business markings had been erased. The town, which only weeks earlier had received refugees, preserved a basic routine, and maintained some structure, had become a ravaged space. Without electricity, without transportation, without institutional order, what had once been a functional agricultural center became a sequence of ruins. The before and after were separated in those 3 days. No one who lived through that transformation could forget what they had witnessed. The destruction did not follow a plan. There were no documents justifying the fires, nor maps of targets. It was the direct result of the absence of command, the impunity of armed groups, and the total collapse of the defense system. The town surrendered, but it was not occupied with rules. It was delivered to fire, looting, and fear. The body as spoil, women under occupation. During the first days of May, the violence ceased to distinguish by age. The Soviet troops, spread across different sectors of the town, began searching homes where women, girls, or elderly women remained, many of them hidden for hours beforehand. Panic spread as it became clear that age, health, or behavior no longer mattered. Some of the victims were barely 10 years old, others were over 70. Later accounts consistently noted that the abuses were frequent, repeated, and committed at any hour of the day. The inhabitants who still retained some measure of control tried to protect their relatives. Many girls were disguised in male clothing, others had their hair cut short, and some elderly women offered themselves as decoys to draw soldiers away from their granddaughters. Improvised shelters lost their effectiveness when patrols discovered hiding places in basements, sheds, or behind false walls. In some homes, all lights were extinguished, windows were sealed, and speaking aloud was forbidden, but such precautions did not always work. Soldiers entered in groups, armed, without announcing themselves. They sought what they considered a right, without heeding pleas or respecting signals of surrender. Many women resorted to extreme measures to avoid being identified as such. Some smeared mud on their faces and clothing, others rolled in garbage or excrement, hoping to dissuade attackers. In certain cases, they tried to feign infectious diseases, invented stories, or displayed fake injuries. However, results varied. Fear paralyzed many. Mothers clutched their daughters, covered them with blankets, or tried to hide them between mattresses, while elderly women attempted to negotiate in Russian or offered valuables as bribes. Logic had disappeared. Any house could become the scene of an assault. Several witnesses claimed that some women were attacked multiple times on the same day. The entries were repeated, sometimes by the same groups, sometimes by different soldiers. In most cases, there was no supervision and no officers present. The entrances were open, and the inner passageways were unguarded. The victims did not know how many more times they would be assaulted. Many families decided to split up, sending the women to neighboring houses, agricultural areas, or distant farms. The idea was to disperse so that not all could be located at once, but the plan did not always succeed. The occupation was already reaching the edges of the urban area. The word revenge circulated among the attackers. Some pronounced it aloud, others murmured it to their comrades. It was the most common justification, expressed in different languages. They referred to the atrocities committed by German soldiers in cities such as Stalingrad, Kiev, or Minsk, and claimed the right to return the harm. That narrative fueled the behavior. It was not questioned whether the women were responsible. Being German was enough to unleash punishment. Even elderly women were dragged into backyards or beaten before the assaults. It was not about obtaining information or eliminating resistance, but a direct action, without demands, without conditions. The population's reaction was varied. Some tried unsuccessfully to intervene, others limited themselves to watching from hiding places or behind closed windows. Families began marking houses with religious symbols, children's drawings or white cloths, hoping this would inspire respect or at least hesitation. But records show that the signs were useless. The attackers ignored the symbols, entered anyway, and committed the abuses. Many houses were left empty after each visit. The victims fled, sought refuge in rural areas, or walked for hours with no fixed destination. Disorientation was total. The local authorities, when they were still present, offered no alternatives. Police stations were evacuated or taken over by the Soviets. Religious centers were closed or in ruins. There were no public shelters or active organizations. Pharmacies had exhausted their supplies of sedatives, antiseptics, or bandages. Some doctors worked clandestinely, treating people in destroyed houses or makeshift basements. Care for the victims was minimal. Many did not speak for days, did not eat, and did not react to stimuli. Girls showed signs of immediate trauma, and elderly women in many cases stopped speaking entirely. Silence became a strategy. Families decided not to share details, not to describe what had happened. Some women hid for years what they had lived through. In certain neighborhoods, a non-verbal agreement was established. Do not ask, do not judge, do not relive. This pact was not always respected. In later gatherings, some victims were singled out or blamed. But during the days of occupation, isolation prevailed. Each family focused on its immediate survival. Houses offered no protection, roads were unsafe, and armed groups moved without fixed direction. Days passed without the situation improving. Some women were taken by force to public buildings where they were held for hours. At times, entire groups were transported out of the urban center. Accounts from women who returned are scarce. Most did not want to tell what happened in those places. Those who did speak described unlit, damp spaces where screams could be heard constantly. They did not know how many people were there, nor how long it would be before they were released. In some cases, they were left on rural roads without clothing or belongings. The places that had once been considered safe, such as schools, churches, or hospitals, lost that status. Soldiers entered them all the same, making no distinction of function or population. In some religious centers, troops were quartered. In hospitals, services were interrupted and patients evacuated. Schools were looted. In those sites as well, abuses were recorded. The victims were not always local women. Some were refugees from other cities, girls who had fled with their families, or elderly women seeking medical help. Misinformation increased the fear. It was said that the soldiers acted under orders and that no one would stop them. Some believed that the rapes were part of an authorized punishment, a perception that discouraged any attempt at reporting, especially given the absence of available channels, trustworthy authorities, and translators. Language barriers worsened the lack of communication. Victims could not explain what had happened, nor understand what was demanded of them. Many simply cried in silence or remained in a fetal position for hours. In certain areas, attempts at defense were minimal. Some men confronted the soldiers armed with household tools or knives, but were overpowered immediately. Others tried to negotiate with cigarettes, liquor, or watches. Most ended up handing over their relatives in exchange for stopping the looting. Later accounts consistently identified helplessness as a constant. There was no way to prevent what was happening, as fear paralyzed all reaction and the speed of the attacks left no time to devise plans. Hiding places were discovered easily, and violence asserted itself within seconds. The physical environment also played a role. The streets were destroyed, full of debris. Smoke made visibility difficult, and ruined houses offered less protection. Movement was limited. People could not run, nor did they know where to flee. Nights were even worse, as total darkness facilitated the group's actions. Lamps had been destroyed and campfires could attract unwanted attention, so many women spent hours motionless, making no sound. The consequences were immediate and profound. Some women stopped communicating, others developed repetitive behaviors, insomnia or nighttime panic. In the days that followed, several cases of self-harm or suicide attempts were recorded, although most went undocumented. Pain was not expressed publicly. It became a private memory, shared only in exceptional circumstances. Many future generations never knew what had happened to their grandmothers or great-grandmothers, as the pact of silence endured beyond the end of the conflict. Some reports compiled later mentioned that the panic was not based solely on rumors or propaganda, but on concrete experiences. What had been feared came to pass. The threat became real, and the occupation turned that part of Germany into a scene of mass abuse. More than 1,000 people chose to die rather than wait for what was coming. During the final days of April and the first days of May, the city of Demmin became the scene of a wave of voluntary deaths that spread through all its neighborhoods. In different parts of the urban center, along rural roads, and in the vicinity of the Peene River, hundreds of people decided to end their lives. The motivations were varied, but there was a shared perception that defeat meant a total loss of dignity. It was not only about immediate fear, but also the conviction that continuing to live under the expected conditions was an unbearable option. The methods chosen were diverse. On the riverbanks, bodies could be seen carried by the current, with sacks of stones tied around their waists. Some used ropes to secure themselves to the bottom, others simply jumped in. The waters of the Peene became a silent reservoir of despair. In later records, bodies were recovered for weeks. Entire families disappeared within hours. Parents with children, grandparents with grandchildren, young women and elderly women shared the same fate. Poison was another widely used method. Pharmacy shelves were emptied, and the available capsules were quickly purchased or taken. Some resorted to homemade substances without knowing the exact doses. The fear of surviving a failed attempt led many to combine methods. Toxic products were ingested, and if consciousness was not lost, knives, firearms, or the river were used. Gunshots were heard at irregular intervals. In many homes, neighbors heard a sequence of dull sounds followed by silence, soon repeated from nearby houses. The streets fell silent, not from tranquility, but from absence. Each block had at least one house where someone had decided to end their story. Closed doors hid scenes that would not be known until days later. Some were locked from the inside, others were opened by survivors or soldiers who discovered what had happened. In several cases, the perpetrators were adults who, after ending the lives of their children, took their own. The idea was to protect the minors from an uncertain future. It was not about hope, but about preventing suffering. Decisions were made collectively within family units. Any prior discussions, if they took place, left no written trace. What remained were the bodies, aligned on beds, sofas, or in sheltered corners. One case that encapsulates that collapse was that of Gerhard Moldenhauer. A police official, he had tried to organize an escape for the residents, but upon seeing his efforts frustrated and realizing that no options remained, he took his own life. His death was symbolic. It represented the disintegration of all command structure, the loss of any institutional reference. Those who knew him understood that if even figures of authority made that decision, the situation was beyond remedy. The town was marked by the simultaneity of the events. There was no single focal point, no linear sequence. The deaths occurred in parallel, in basements, kitchens, sheds, and nearby fields. There were no safe areas. Desperation did not distinguish between neighborhoods. Some zones, more densely populated, recorded a greater number of cases, but the accounts were repeated across the entire urban area. Each group acted autonomously, though with similar patterns. No one knew how many others were doing the same, and there was no coordination or prior warning. In the local cemetery and in the yards of private homes, improvised graves were dug. Those who still had the strength tried to bury their relatives. In some cases, names were placed on pieces of wood. In others, no identification was left. Multiple graves were common. The aim was to contain decomposition, prevent epidemics, or simply fulfill one last act of respect. Tools were scarce. Shovels were shared among neighbors, and bodies were wrapped in blankets, sheets, or coats. The river, in addition to being a site of suicide, became a channel of drift. The currents carried bodies toward lower areas, and in certain spots inhabitants tried to pull them from the water. Some were recognized, others were not. The accumulation forced intervention with precarious means. The water became contaminated, and direct consumption was prohibited. Along the banks, animals avoided approaching. The smell was constant, even from a distance. In later testimonies, several survivors spoke of the silence. During those days, no one asked questions or made comments. Each family was focused on surviving or on coming to terms with their loss. Doors were shut quickly, windows remained covered, and in the streets, steps were brief and movements urgent. There was no time for mourning. The priority was to endure. Only later, with the arrival of a certain calm, did the stories begin to be told. Some people left written notes, brief statements, single words or farewells addressed to relatives. Most of these texts reflected exhaustion. They did not speak of hope or return. They spoke of not wanting to go on, of not being able to bear what was coming, of not recognizing the world they were in. These phrases, found next to bodies or affixed to walls, were kept by neighbors or later compiled by chroniclers. The phenomenon was not exclusive to Demmin. In other German cities, similar episodes took place. The difference lay in the scale. Here, the geographical conditions, the isolation, the lack of escape routes, and the generalized panic contributed to an exceptional number of deaths. It is estimated that more than 1,000 people took their own lives during those days. The exact figure could not be confirmed. Some bodies were never found, others were buried without record. Suicide was taken as a collective way out. These were not isolated cases or unconnected individual decisions. There was an atmosphere that pushed toward that resolution. The dominant narrative was that there was no possible future, that the only dignified thing was to decide the end. In some sectors, that conviction was reinforced by ideas transmitted over years: honor, sacrifice, resistance in the face of the unthinkable. Political symbols, family values, and concrete desperation became intertwined. In the memory of many survivors, those days remained as a void, not from a lack of events, but from an excess of them. Everything happened simultaneously, without pauses or relief. Losses piled up within hours. What had once been a living city became a suspended space. Later accounts did not always agree on details, but all shared the same feeling. What was experienced had no precedent and no comparison. The remnants of that experience stayed in the collective memory. Families rebuilt their houses, but not always their bonds. Common spaces were repurposed, yet the emotional burden persisted. Certain corners remained marked by what had happened. Some streets were avoided, some names left unspoken. Later, generations heard fragmented versions. Not everyone wanted to remember, and not everyone was willing to speak. Over time, comparisons emerged. Some thought of Magda Goebbels and her children, of the bunkers where death was chosen over accepting defeat, of the high-ranking officials who opted for suicide rather than surrender. These references justified nothing, but showed that the idea was not marginal, that at different levels choosing death was a recurring outcome. In Demen, that decision reached the general population. The town was united by that fact. Beyond differences, the accounts converged in their pain. The mass suicide was not planned. It was a shared reaction to an unbearable reality. The memory of those days lives on in archives, in recovered photographs, and in the testimonies that, over time, began to be shared. The testimony of Waltraud Reschke. Waltraud Reschke was at home with her sick mother, her younger sister, and her grandmother. As she recounted, the sounds of the Red Army could be heard long before they could be seen. The metallic rattling of the tanks was constant and unbearable. To protect themselves, they barricaded themselves inside the house, placing furniture against all the doors, convinced that this would be enough. When the soldiers arrived and realized no one was opening, they began pounding violently. The doors eventually gave way. In an attempt to stay out of reach, the family moved from room to room. The soldiers were searching for watches and jewelry, taking everything they found, and when they could find no more valuables, they left and moved on to other houses. For a brief moment, they thought they were no longer in danger. Waltraud remembered the sounds of the fire and the creaking of collapsing structures. From the back window, she saw the flames reach the neighboring yard and advance quickly. In the confusion, they cried out without knowing what to do. The grandmother, who remained calm, gathered the essentials, placed the items in a handcart, and led the family through the backyard to the street. They sought to go unnoticed. Their goal was to reach the home of relatives living in a village 15 kilometers away. On the way, a group of Soviet soldiers intercepted them, searched the cart's contents, and took everything they still had. Then they turned their attention to Waltraud's mother and led her to a nearby grove. The girls tried to follow, but the soldiers stopped them with the butts of their rifles. It was the grandmother who managed to calm them. After some time, the mother returned in silence. She took care of washing her daughters. The next day, they arrived at the family's farm and settled in an attic room. But the suffering was not over. In the same house lived a Polish woman who had worked as a servant, deported during the war. Seeing Soviet soldiers nearby, she led them to the hiding place. Waltraud's mother was taken away for the last time. The girl, who had already witnessed far too much to understand, knew that what was happening to those women was atrocious. Waltraud said that, for her, childhood ended at that moment. Everything she had lived through forced her into a premature maturity. In time, she never stopped thinking about her grandmother, her resolve, and how she had been the pillar for them all. She would be eternally grateful to her. Years later, Waltraud returned to Demmin and sat by the Peene River. Behind her rose the church towers. The sky was clear, and ducks swam on the calm surface. It was hard for her to believe that this very place had once been the scene of so much pain, and that during those days her family's life had changed so profoundly and irreversibly. The numbers and the silence. At the end of the occupation, Demen was left with a devastated human landscape. The magnitude of the deaths overwhelmed the capacity of both the survivors and the local authorities to respond. Recovering and burying so many bodies became a difficult task, due both to the condition of the corpses and the shortage of resources and personnel. During the first weeks, attempts were made to bury those who could be identified. Many remains were placed in mass graves, without name or inscription, in remote or improvised areas. Other bodies remained exposed for days, in the heat and disorder. The town lacked the means to keep an exact record of what had happened, and the volume of victims meant that efforts to document each case were minimal or non-existent. With the establishment of the German Democratic Republic, the subject of the mass suicides in Demmin was systematically silenced. The official narrative avoided any reference to those events. Speaking about what had happened was considered subversive. The dominant account focused on the crimes of fascism and on the Soviet victory, leaving no space for the memory of those who had died out of fear or despair. The authorities of the GDR did not allow public commemorations nor erect memorial monuments. Official records remained incomplete, and attempts to collect testimonies were restricted. Those who had lived through the final days of the conflict learned to remain silent. It was not spoken of in schools, in the media, or at public events. Only after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc did spaces begin to open for revisiting the past. Historians, journalists, and relatives began a slow reconstruction of what had happened. Among the first to address these events was Carsten Behrens, who analyzed the emotional and political impact of the prolonged silence. In his research, he noted that for years the collective trauma of Demmin was twofold, for what had been experienced and for the imposed silence about it. The absence of an official memorial in the town has been a subject of debate. For some, it represents a debt to local history. For others, a way to avoid reopening deep wounds. However, memory has begun to find other paths. On symbolic dates, flowers have been placed in unmarked locations. Some plaques have been discreetly added by neighbors or memory groups. Private gatherings have also been organized, where descendants of the victims share memories and fragments of what still remains in diaries or letters. Today, although the records remain incomplete and many identities are still unconfirmed, it is accepted that around 1,000 people lost their lives in Demmin as a direct consequence of that final collapse. The exact number remains uncertain, but historiographical consensus approaches that figure. Documentary testimony has made it possible to reconstruct not only the events, but also the conditions that led to them. Among those who have spoken publicly about this tragedy, a final phrase resonates, spoken at one of the most recent memorial acts. "Today I hope we can find peace." With those words, a silent ceremony closed, without applause or speeches, at the very place where, decades earlier, horror overcame the future.